Good morning. I asked for water, there's 4 cups of water up here. Now I have to avoid spilling. Thank you for that very gracious introduction, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be here today. I know that Michelle is a mentor and role model and valued colleague to many of you. And it's true, we did work together when I was going through my residency at Yale. Michelle is actually the main reason I got into Yale. When I was interviewing for residency positions, many of the programs were very skeptical of my interest in politics and saw that as a negative. Michelle, on the other hand, thought that was a big plus and went to bat for me. So thank you, Michelle, for your support in that era. So I'm going to talk about pandemics, planetary health, and national security, which are 3 really big issues that are usually not conjoined. So we'll see if I can make this both coherent and interesting. My intent is to be provocative rather than definitive. And I want to start by saying that I am not a global health expert. But I think many things in the world, including the direction and the acceleration of technologies, particularly biotechnologies, the national security interests of this country and many others, and the condition of our planet are all coming together in a way that's going to have great impact on global health. So this is Joshua Lederberg, who received a Nobel Prize at the age of 33 for his works on the genetic recombination of E. coli. He's also a Stanford faculty member, founder of the Department of Statistics. Oh, I see, okay. It's the big picture that's showing. Was remarkable in many ways, but also because he was, throughout his life, a close advisor to government. And he wrote a very elegant essay in Science magazine in 2000 that I think is pertinent to why we're gathered here today. He said, as we enter the 21st century, infectious diseases faded to remain a crucial research challenge, one of conceptual intricacy and of global consequence. And he remarks on how fitful and sporadic human evolution is, pitted against the far more rapidly changing genomes of microbial pathogens. And goes on to say that the rules of encounter and engagement between humans and microbes are changing. And he predicts that the future of humanity and microbes likely will unfold as episodes of a suspense thriller that could be titled Our Wits versus Their Genes. And he goes on to ask, how do we increase our knowledge and put it to good use to protect us? And how can we use this dance with microbes to learn more about the natural history of disease and fundamental biological and evolutionary mechanisms? And he makes a very important point. He says that the starting point for thinking about these issues, for thinking about infectious disease, is to recognize that humans and plants and animals and microbes are co-inhabitants of the earth. And maintaining a stable relationship between microbes and humans, that is one where neither side dies or is wiped out completely, depends on a stable relationship between ecological and evolutionary forces. And what I'm going to suggest today is that we may be at a point where human activities are impacting this balance of our shared ecosystems. and we are provoking more and more dangerous pathogens and infectious disease outbreaks. And I'm going to raise the question of whether we are also perturbing geological forces in ways that could return domination of the Earth to the microbes, as has actually happened in 5 previous mass extinctions, when the planet changed its geological age and went through hellish periods of flood, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think there's a lot of reason to think that this is an opportune time for doing research on pandemics. First of all, the need is increasingly urgent to gain more knowledge about naturally occurring infectious diseases, accidental releases of dangerous microbes from laboratories, and also deliberate attacks using biological weapons. I also think that advances in our understanding of the life sciences, as well as the new capabilities that we are creating with biotechnologies of all sorts, and actually other technologies as well, hold tremendous promise for our ability to control the instabilities in our cohabitation with microbes. And finally, I think that there is at this moment an alignment of national security priorities in the United States and elsewhere, particularly in other democracies, and the recognition that pandemics and planetary health are top priorities. I want to say a few more things about that. President Biden and his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, who I heard talk at a Council on Foreign Relations meeting, have said that the 3 strategic national priorities facing the U.S. now are, number 1, pandemic threats and managing COVID, of course. Number 2 is what do we do about climate warming? And number 3 is geopolitical competition with China. Now, you may not think that these are interactive and synergistic, but I think they will be. The third threat, competition with China, is not imaginary. China has said very definitively it intends to be the dominant political system in the world, and it's going to do that through technological dominance. And China lists 7 technologies that it believes are strategically important and it intends to command, including biotechnologies, human health, and genomics. They need those technologies for their own purposes. They have a huge health problem, even before their current COVID dilemma. They have enormous food insecurity problems. Their land and their water is extremely polluted, and they have an aging population. So they have very strong domestic reasons for excelling in biotechnology. But they also see biotechnology and dominance in these areas, and they've said this quite explicitly, as a geopolitical chip in their contest with the United States. As a consequence of that, the United States government, both parties in the government, are willing to make big investments in advancing science and technology, including biotechnology, over the coming years, and I will come back to that. So I think there's a convergence here that will serve the purposes of global health research and pandemic research very strongly. This is, I realize, a probably incomprehensible graphic from an article by David Morans and Tony Fauci. It was published in September of 2020. In the thick of the pandemic, and it was titled "How We Got to COVID-19." And basically what this shows is that newly emerging, re-emerging, and delivered epidemics of infectious disease are a global phenomenon. Human activities and practices are now the key drivers of emergence. Now, this has been true since the beginning of human history to some extent. When humans started farming and domesticating animals 12,000 years ago, they discovered that living in crowded quarters with each other and their animals without sanitation was a bad idea. And then we had lots of examples of trade and travel, particularly along the Silk Road and trade routes from Asia to Europe, causing massive epidemics such as the Black Plague. And then the New World imported all of its terrible pathogens, and the Old World imported its pathogens into the New World to devastating effect on the natives of the Western Hemisphere. So it's not new that what humans do is one of the chief factors in causing outbreaks of disease. But we had a period in the 70s and into the 80s, maybe the 60s into the 80s, when we got very complacent about infectious disease. And in fact, when I was a resident, no one wanted to go into infectious disease because people thought it was boring. We had fixed that problem. I'm serious. I remember a conversation to that effect. And then came HIV/AIDS. And then shortly thereafter came this cascade of outbreaks: West Nile fever, Lyme disease, dengue, chikungunya, Ebola, Zika, Marburg, SARS, MERS, COVID. And also, what we are seeing is that sometime in the last century, we seem to have passed a tipping point in which the rates of environmental change caused by humans have exceeded, usually by magnitudes of order, the rate of change caused by natural and geologic processes. So, for example, erosion and sedimentation rates caused by humans are 10 times that caused by all the rivers of the world. Sea level rise did not change for 7,000 years, and now it's rising by a foot per century. It's projected to rise by 2 feet per century starting in 2100. Ocean chemistry was stable for millions of years, and now is becoming steadily more acidic. Extinction rates are 1 to 10,000 times above background levels. And of course, atmospheric CO2, now at 400 parts per million, is higher than it was at any time in the last 4 million years. And current emissions by humans, which are still increasing, exceed those of all the world's volcanoes, which are the source of natural CO2 emissions into the atmosphere, by a factor of 10. So the magnitude and the variety of human-caused planetary changes is actually equivalent to the changes seen in the 5 mass extinctions the planet has experienced thus far, with the exception of the meteorite that killed the dinosaurs. But those extinctions unfolded over thousands of years. This is happening in a century. And so some geologists have proposed that name a formal division of the geologic timescale, such as the Pleistocene, which was the Ice Age, and the Holocene, which is basically the entire period of human civilization and what we think of as human civilization, that we name the current era that is underway the Anthropocene, the human era, because humans are now the main driver of planetary forces, which are in turn the main determinants of biosystems and the balance of life in all its many forms on Earth. So this is a rather simplistic graphic of spillover of where pandemics come from. On the left, you have animals and birds of all sorts in their own environments, and occasionally an animal microbe will spill over into humans and make that human sick. That's usually the end of it. Maybe several people get sick. Usually it goes unobserved and goes no farther than that. But sometimes those small clusters of humans actually transmit the microbe, the disease, to others. And you get a cluster that may or may not be observed, probably not. And if it keeps going unopposed, you'll have an outbreak that becomes planet-wide, then you have a pandemic. Now, this whole spillover process, going from the first animals to transmit the disease to humans, to clusters of humans, can take weeks, months, or even decades in the case of HIV. It is a long fuse. And obviously, what we would like to do is intervene and stop transmission as far to the left as we can, including, let's just stop spillover, which we'll talk about. This is what is going on, and there are many drivers of this which we will discuss. The traditional drivers of spillover and of infectious disease outbreaks are, as we've said, trade and travel patterns. This has been true since the beginning of history, but now we move across the globe in 24 hours, and we do so in great volumes. On an average day, U.S. airlines service 25,000 flights into and out of the country and carry 2.3 million passengers and over 66,000 tons of cargo. And there's microbes in all of them, right? So that's problematic. And I can tell you, having worked with Customs and Border Protection and TSA, preventing something nasty from coming into the country is all but impossible. It's just too enormous a problem. Changes in land use are one of the major drivers of outbreaks. And we have now devoted half of the land mass of the planet to agriculture. And demand for food is going to increase that portion, as will the loss of arable land and climate change, erosion, et cetera, et cetera. Urbanization is a big problem. People are living more and more in crowded megacities because they have to leave the coastline, et cetera, or they're facing violence. And they're living close to each other with poor sanitation and nutrition, which makes them a setup for infectious disease and also a perfect way to spread it amongst millions of people. The wild meat trade is huge, really huge. Not just in China, which we hear a lot about, but particularly in South America in the rainforest, which is bad for the animals and bad for the forest and bad for infection control. Then we have the exotic pet trade, which is also much bigger than you can imagine. And industrial animal agriculture, where lots of monoculture animals are living in crowded, stressful conditions, making them a setup for infection and creating opportunities for transferring microbes to large numbers of animals. And now we have to think about climate change effects as drivers of outbreaks. There's several articles, one in particular that's cited here, that shows that the species extinction we are now experiencing is going to create more outbreaks and more disease among animals. The relationship between having less biodiversity and more disease is complicated, but it's been observed and it's pretty well documented, I believe. And of course, vectors of disease are going to change their geographic ranges as the climate warms and rainfall becomes erratic. If you're an arthropod and prefer wet, warm conditions, you're going to move to find those conditions, meaning that you're going to see dengue in Florida and Texas and so forth. There's also a recent article in July of 22 that conducted a systemic analysis using modeling to try and investigate the implications of cross-species virus sharing under different climatic conditions. They modeled a range of land use and climate circumstances, and they focused on how these changes will alter the geographic ranges of 3,800 species of wild mammals. This is a big model. And they found that rising global temperatures will force animals to seek better pastures, as it were. Some won't be able to do that have mountain ranges or oceans or rivers in their range, but many will. And as a consequence, you're going to see more cross-species transmission of viruses as their geographic range changes. Most of these viral sharing episodes are going to be between wild mammals, which is obviously bad for the wildlife. But human-animal encounters are most likely to happen in highly populated and agricultural areas, which has implications, obviously, for spillover and new human diseases. And they also found that even if we slow climate warming successfully, it's not going to stop this increased virus sharing among mammals. It will slow it down, but it's already underway, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. They also found that bats are likely to be a key driver. The poor bats. They're always the bad guy in spillovers and zoonoses for good reason. They live in very dense colonies. They carry thousands of viruses at any one time, including an incredible range of coronaviruses, and they can fly. So they can get out, and they're already moving. The black box bats that harbor Nipah virus have already moved 200 miles south in Australia, which is north from the northern hemisphere, where it's cooler, and presumably will continue to move. So climate changes are becoming a major driver of outbreaks. Now for national security. COVID has killed 1 million Americans. It's cost us probably around $16 trillion is the best modeling estimate. It's caused a lot of damage to the government's credibility, and it's harmed key organizations like hospitals, who have yet to recover from the experience, killed many businesses and the financial security of a lot of citizens, and it's had long-term damage, as is clear, on the mental health of Americans, as well as children's education and so forth. And it's not gone away. So you would think it would be a no-brainer that pandemics are a national security issue. But there are people in the government who think that the big problem is too much government intervention, that it will go away on its own, we don't need to worry about it, and that we spent too much money already. This, in spite of all of the money that we spent on past outbreaks of disease, which moves into the billions very quickly if you start adding up Ebola in West Africa, H1N1 flu, Zika, et cetera. But the members of Congress not on those committees don't actually appreciate the amount of money we've spent so far on disease outbreaks. Now, I said that the Biden administration sees its three big national security priorities as pandemics, climate, and competition with China, which is essentially a technological competition. But there are lots of people, including Republicans, in the Congress who are very intent on taking the lessons learned from the COVID pandemic and improving our capacity to respond. And this includes not just research money, but a whole taxonomy of capabilities that have to be in place to really move the world. Obviously, you need the underlying science and the knowledge. You need to know what's going on and what you might do about it. You need technologies, which are essentially tools to leverage the forces of nature. They give us new capabilities. You need authority. One of the problems of the pandemic is CDC did not have the authority to demand data from the states. Organizational capacity was also lacking. You have to be able to organize and execute. You have to move fast. You have to get the talent that you need, as well as the money. And you have to move at scale. There are very few organizations that can really do this, and certainly not enough on the international level that can deal with phenomena like global pandemics in an efficient and coherent way. So all of these things have to come together. And there has to be some minimal atmosphere of trust and credibility as well, which was also sorely lacking in our response to the pandemic thus far. So that you don't have to fight for every move you want to make, or every dollar that you want to spend. But I'm very encouraged to see this atmospheric river of legislation that is coming out of the Congress that pertains to the pandemic and getting better at managing infectious disease as well as climate change. I'm not going to go through all of these legislative efforts, but I'm going to mention a couple because they're so important. The Chips and Science Act is intended to bolster American semiconductor manufacturing, but it is also the biggest investment in science and technology in a generation. It's $280 million for science and technology to build technology hubs regionally, to increase the number and the diversity of people in STEM studies, including global health. A huge amount of money for the Department of Energy and the national labs to study both biology, including genomics, as well as climate science. Very important bill. The Prevent Pandemics Act has been passed that established ARPA-H, which is supposed to try and make breakthrough progress in the health sciences. The Senate Health Committee on COVID origins was a very serious effort. It was a minority report, but it is not partisan, and it makes a very plausible case for a lab leak as the source of the COVID epidemic. The Department of Defense has big plans for making its own medical countermeasures, which I don't think will be fully funded. And the President's National Biodefense Strategy and the Executive Order on Advancing Biotechnology and Biomanufacturing are actually two integrated, very serious attempts to take on these problems. The Executive Order on Bioeconomy is particularly interesting and strong because it doesn't just say, we want to do this, this, and this, as many executive orders do. It actually tasks the agencies, and almost all of the agencies, to come up with very specific plans about how we advance the bioeconomy, how we are going to gather the biological data that we need to further science, and how we are going to build a biomanufacturing empire. So this is the beginning of the infrastructure that we need to see Drew Endy's dreams of the age of synthetic biology come true. This is a very serious effort. And we will see what happens to that, but it's worth taking a look at. And then later this year, we're going to have to reauthorize the Pandemics and All Hazard Preparedness Act, which was authored by Senator Richard Burr, a Republican from North Carolina, now retired. And that has to be reauthorized one way or another. And the question is, what will be in it? That will be a fight. That will be a fight. I don't think I'll say much on this slide. I was going to hit the high points of the pandemic so far, but I think you know those. As of it still amazes me. As of yesterday, the WHO said that there were 664 million cases of COVID in the world and 6.7 million deaths. It's probably about twice both of those numbers if you look at expected deaths. In the US, 100 million cases and 1 million deaths. It's amazing to me. 1 million deaths. That's more than one 9/11 every week. And we're in our third year. And those levels of cases and deaths are much lower than they were 1 or 2 years ago. The big news is the vaccines. 70 companies joined the effort to try and make a vaccine. 100 different vaccines went into clinical trials. Enormous progress, and that is the result of the biorevolution that's going on. I'm going to skip this too. This is the way that my colleagues and I at BNext thought about how we would go about investing in technologies to manage epidemics. We can talk about that later. But these are the questions that I wanted to pose to you. I'm sorry I talked so long. This always happens to me. I apologize. And I'm going to talk about, I'm going to ask a series of questions that pertains to Josh Lederberg's musings, and also what kind of research, what kind of accomplishments we might want to aim for. The first one is, can we move much faster from scientific knowledge to operational capabilities? And can we do it faster? We have to do this. Biology in particular is very slow and very clumsy at translating knowledge into products, into capabilities. And one of the things we have to do is we have got to engage the private sector more fully. We have to build an industry of public health, because government is never going to pay for everything that we need. We have to figure out some ways to make some aspects of public health a profitable enterprise so that private industry starts creating the capabilities that we need. Can we build the data systems that are going to be essential for outbreak surveillance and situational awareness? This was a terrible failing in COVID response. We just have not invested in public health data. We don't have interoperable electronic health records as they do in Britain, which is a tremendous advantage in doing rapid representative trials and figuring out what worked and what didn't. And we really have to build sustainable, user-friendly, secure genomic databases to move to the next stage of the biological revolution. GenBank has to be upgraded. It's not user-friendly. Nobody wanted to put their sequences into GenBank during the pandemic. We need international standards for genomics, and we need to build a map of where these genomic databases are. A lot of them are in private hands, and the executive order places a big emphasis on a data initiative. We also need a much more robust pipeline of people going into pandemic research, prevention, and management. And in particular, we need more people with technical backgrounds in government. That means you. Government really has to have more technical expertise. And I'm here to tell you that it is not a restful experience to be in government, but it is a view of the horizon and an opportunity to make a difference you will not get in any other role. But we cannot move forward without more people who know what they're doing in the government at all levels, state and federal. And finally, can we create an international community of common interest and collaboration? There's a lot to say here, but I would just say that I think the United States needs to use its convening power more forcefully. We need to call the meeting to figure out what are the protocols for figuring out the origin of spillovers, for figuring out a new biosafety and biosecurity regime instead of standards. And we need to figure out a protocol that determines very early in an outbreak what the mode of disease transmission is. This was another failing in COVID. WHO was very reluctant to declare an airborne transmission mechanism. And we've got to be able to make vaccines and other kind of measures at scale and very rapidly for the entire world. So, let me end, we'll skip that one. Let me end with this. This is a quote from Václav Havel, who's one of my heroes. He was a poet and a playwright and president of Czechoslovakia. And he spent years in prison for his opposition to the Soviet regime. And 1 year after being arrested, he was not only president, but he was addressing the US Congress. This is what he said. He said, "The salvation of this world, this human world, lies nowhere else than in the human heart, in the human power to reflect, in human modesty, and in human responsibility. It's all about what we can imagine and what we're willing to do together." Thank you.
I don't care for a little over time. What I'd like to do is ask if there are any Q&As. Having her here is a gift, and this is your opportunity to ask her some questions. A question?
Thank you, Dr. Berry. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak out in all of us. I know you have a very busy schedule. My name is Samuel Castro. I'm a second year medical student here at Stanford. My question is, especially on your last point of your PowerPoint, if all these pandemic prevention ideas and policy changes come from high-income countries, how can we get low and middle-income countries a seat at the table when they're focusing on other problems such as neocolonialism, poverty, corruption, and health crises of their own? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a problem. There's a lot going on at any given time. You know, the planet's doing stuff we didn't even know about a century ago as a consequence of our activities. The bugs are doing stuff. There's all sorts of political things going on at any one time. That's why I think that this convergence of science, of the pandemic, the objective, visible example of what could happen, and a congressional interest in doing something is so special. Those convergences are very difficult to bring about. And often you have to work very, very hard to even get everybody in the same room. But that's what it's all about. Change is hard. I think low and middle income countries have suffered terribly from this pandemic. I think they would be happy to be called to a meeting. They may have different ideas about what to do. And I do think that the richer countries need to take responsibility for things like climate change, which we cause, and also what to do about pandemics. But it's very difficult.
Other questions?
Mine was a retired neurostudent. I'm glad you mentioned about our role in the world, taking a leadership role with other countries. I guess I would suggest in my travels overseas, we need to clean up our own house. If we keep electing rather bizarre government officials, like our previous president, and having very unusual situations like gun violence and what we're doing in reproductive rights in this country, I think we lose a lot of respect overseas. So maybe we ought to spend a little more time cleaning up our own house before we try to get others to follow along.
Yeah, I don't think it's either or.
Yeah.
You know, I think we have to be humble, which we're not good at this country. And there really is a lot to do. I mean, there's no deficit of problems to be solved.
I'm going to ask Tara a question. Did anybody else have a question? Do you have a question?
Yeah.
Gee? Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Greg Franklin. I have a question. You've got this list of almost insurmountable problems to be solved. So, are there any out there that are what could be regarded as lowest hanging fruit in terms of biggest bang for buck?
I'm sorry, say it again.
What's up there of all those problems that's low laying fruit, big spend? What can you attack?
Well, I think there's a number of them. I mean, if you remember the capability list, if you want new technological capabilities, then creating really comprehensive, easy to use, and accurate databases of all sorts is a good place to start. And that is a very high return on investment. Imagine if we had something near perfect situational awareness from the second week of the pandemic, as opposed to waiting months for effective diagnostics. We couldn't even count cases while the Northeast was ablaze in cases. So that would be one thing. I think we could establish biosecurity and biosafety rules for labs with the willing cooperation of other countries. It would cost almost nothing to do that, maybe a little bit more to implement them, but it's not a lot of money. And we might save ourselves an accidental pandemic. Those are two.
My last question,
Yes.
Tara, what keeps you up at night when you think about pandemics and pandemic preparedness? What's the next big pandemic that makes you lose sleep? How do we prepare for it? 20 seconds or less.
So this would sound terrible to all of you in public health and medicine, but I worry about the animals. I mean, right now, we have the biggest avian flu outbreak going on in the United States in history. H5N1 is devastating poultry and wild birds. I think it was 1,600 snow geese died in Colorado last week from infection with H5N1. And we killed over 60 million birds, either died from the infection or we culled them. And we just learned the 2 grizzly bears in Montana had H5N1. So the question becomes, has it jumped to mammals? And then what? So I'm just so sad about the possibility that we are unintentionally, but knowingly killing the biosphere. All of those animals that are so important to our health and are so lovely and beautiful are going to disappear. We've already killed 30% of all bird species in the last 40 years. So I worry about that. I think the humans are going to need to protect themselves, but we may be too late to take care of the animals and maybe the insects and so forth.
Thank you very much, Carl.